Okay, so let me just do a quick test. Can everybody hear me okay? If you can, just give me a thumbs up or a chat box. Yeah, raised hand. Good, good, good. Excellent. It's helpful when there's more than one person on the panelist list, but don't have that today. So here we go. So let's just jump into it. Um, the reason why I wanted to do this class is primarily because a lot of people are familiar with integral consciousness or the evolution of consciousness or just sort of interested in consciousness studies. But from my participation in the Gene Gebser Society and just having read Gebser's work, I often feel like he's kind of an understated phenomenologist and scholar of consciousness from the 20th century. And this is too bad because there's so much rich insight in his work that would only benefit us to really kind of wrestle with and work with. That it would just be good to have him out there in the public more. So if everybody can see these slides, we're going to be starting right now. Okay. So this is a translation, I should mention outright, by Aaron Cheek. And Aaron Cheek is doing some new translations of Gebser from German into English. There is really only one official translation by August McCunis from the 1980s, and that's of ever-present origin, and that's this book right here, this big book right here. But there really hasn't been a demand for more of Gebser's work in English, unfortunately, over the past few decades until recently, which is great. So we're beginning to do that work. And there's a Gene Gebser project at Rebido.press. And you could check that out as well. One of my own books is coming out at Rebido too, which is kind of bringing some of these things together. But I open with a poem because Gebser was a poet. And he writes, "The shining winter sky is close enough to touch. And you too are this sky. No reason to distinguish, for all the stars flow through your veins." So first of all, who was Gebser? Well, he was born in 1905 and he passed away in 1973. Interestingly, the 70s, of course, are kind of the high watermark of consciousness culture and a lot of these consciousness movements, which he was alive long enough to see the tail end of. And his prominence as a writer back then began to be noticed towards the end of his life, unfortunately, when his health was failing. So he wasn't really able to engage, but he certainly did appreciate the folks of the counterculture in the 60s and 70s. So Gebser himself was a poet. He was a scholar of Rilke, and he was very interested in contemporary art. In contemporary art, I mean the art of his time. He was friends with Lorca, the poet Lorca, and you could call him a phenomenologist of consciousness. He was also a contemporary of Teilhard de Chardin and Sri Aurobindo, and he actually mentions them both in Ever-Present Origin in the second edition as being sort of peers who independently came to some similar insights that he was about consciousness. A little bit more biographical notes just to kind of situate him and contextualize him. So one of the things that kind of got him started about these very interesting questions was what he noticed in poetry. And so I always kind of recommend, if you're going to start thinking about how consciousness evolves or transforms, you should really look at how language transforms. So he was following in the footsteps, both spiritually and scholarly, of Rilke. He was kind of following the biographical footsteps of Rilke through Europe into Spain. And that poem, I believe, was written in the winter in Spain. It's a passage from the poem I just shared. And he was friends with Lorca and many Spanish poets. He was in Spain for quite some time, and he wrote a book, one of his first books, called Rilke in Spain, which is currently being translated. He lived a very interesting life. He lived between two world wars. So he certainly saw a lot of the kind of calamities and catastrophes that were occurring in Western Europe and Western consciousness and really the globe. So I think the kind of direness of the situation in the early to mid 20th century really kind of accelerated his own passion and interest and insight into understanding what's going on with consciousness so that all of these things were occurring. So yeah, he has a few interesting early biographical near misses with death. Actually, the border of Spain was closed during the whole fascist event. Oh, Hold on a second. Sorry. Um, and he made it out. He made it through the border, but he was nearly shot and executed. And unfortunately, his buddy Lorca was killed at the border. So he was very much, in experiencing a kind of totalitarian Geist rising through Europe and trying to understand what that was all about. He was also friends with Carl Jung and D.T. Suzuki. They corresponded with each other, especially later in life with Suzuki. And then you can see a couple of his other publications as you go along here. But The Ever-Present Origin was published in 1948, 1949, with the second edition in 1950. And later in life, he began more of an interest in not just European consciousness and sort of European history, but moving into studying China and Japan and that whole realm of study. And of course, some of it is sort of dated because he had a very critical opinion of Eastern philosophy and Eastern spirituality, which kind of softened as he got older and really began to encounter it. So those books will eventually be translated, and I'm very much interested in reading them. So here's a little copy of The Ever-Present Origin. Not sure if that's the first edition or not, but so here we go. And let me see if I can just get this here. So he's talking about a new consciousness. This is him talking very at the beginning of Ever-Present Origin. And he's saying that, it is not based on any speculations into mankind's mutations, but on insights into mankind's mutations and the primordial or beginnings up to the present, or perhaps novel insights into the forms of consciousness manifest in the various epochs of mankind, insight into the powers behind their realization as manifest between origin in the present and active in origin and the present. We're going to go into what origin and presence means. We're going to kind of open these terms up a little bit so you can understand them as we go along. And then he writes, and as the origin before all time is the entirety of the very beginning, so too is the present, the entire of everything, temporal and time-bound, including the effectual reality of all time phases, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and even the pre-temporal and timelessness. So what is this? What exactly are we looking at? What is this timelessness, the present? So Gebser takes a phenomenological approach to understanding consciousness. And phenomenology, this is just a standard definition from Stanford. It's structures of experience or consciousness, the appearance of things. And phenomenology studies conscious experience as experience from the subjective or first-person point of view. And I would say that Gebser's phenomenology is a little bit broader than this, but this is a good place to start. It's also linked with other fields such as ontology and epistemology. And here are a few famous, more well-known phenomenologists of consciousness who I would recommend reading, especially Merleau-Ponty. Okay. And again, these notes will be all shared, so if you miss anything, you can check out the recording and check out the PowerPoint later on. So that's phenomenology. So what Gebser's looking at, when I mentioned he's studying language, he's looking at other forms of art. He's looking at what constitutes the structures. And what he's looking at is the experience of, here are some orienting questions. What is our experience of space? Do objects have numinous qualities? For example, how is space experienced for us in a movie theater versus driving a car? Or how is space experienced for us taking a hike on a mountain or navigating through a city, for instance? How do we experience time? What is the passage of time like for us? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, or even decades-long experiences of the passage of time? Is it linear? Is it circular? Is it rhythmic? What about the moments where we feel that no time is passing? And have these experiences of space and time changed? How do they flow or stop or stretch or shorten throughout our lives, throughout our days? What do we notice about our sensory experience during these shifts and changes, our sense of world? And these are kind of orienting questions for you to begin to get a sense of how we're going to be approaching consciousness, how we're going to be approaching the phenomenology of consciousness, and the things that human beings leave behind that we have to look at and try to discern through time, through history, how people of another time experienced all of these things. What was their sense of being in the world? So some more questions here. How has language transformed our experience of reality? What happened when you learned a new language or read an old book or switched mediums? For example, all of us these days have times where we kind of stop reading for a little while and we stay on the internet a little too much, and we end up having a different kind of mode of acquiring information. It's very quick. Or, of course, on social media with tweets and Facebook and so on. It's a different kind of way of navigating the world and information and sort of perceiving the world that can really change you. And this sort of goes also into what we aren't really going to get into today, but could be its own class, which is sort of the media studies perspective. And that's sort of Marshall McLuhan and that whole thing, which is very related. And in fact, one of the books that I'm going to recommend by William Irwin Thompson called Coming into Being, that's also in the notes, explores this question about how media studies is also a good way into understanding or trying to understand how consciousness transforms over time by studying the way our mediums, the way we communicate changes. So, let's see. I see somebody raise their hand. And if you want me to slow down, just let me know in the chat box and I will certainly try to explain things. There's also, if you're just coming on, there is a chat box and there's also a Q&A box if you'd like to take questions. And we will be taking questions, I promise, towards the end of the session. So that these are more orienting questions. And has a book ever changed the way you saw the world for a while? Or even a story, the kind of symbolic. You'll have to excuse my cat if you can hear her. She's accompanying me for this lecture, Sophie. Books contain a kind of symbolic language that can sort of transform the way you experience reality for a little while. Here's another good question. What is language like in dreams or in daytime reverie or just simply in the waking state? How do objects feel before and after meditation or even a walk? So these are kind of build us up to what Gebser's methodology is, which is the phenomenological approach. And it really looks at and it pays careful attention to specific expressions of art, language, culture, and it draws insights on phenomenology. Another word for it could be Umwelt and the life world, the kind of way an organism, a being is in the world and experiences the world. The importance, again, there's an importance in Gebser's work of encountering these works of art and to encounter these phenomenological objects, as it were, and the relations between the self and the object. So, and the importance of tangible, phenomenological, and experiential encounters with the structures of consciousness, avoiding wherever possible exclusionary mental abstraction devoid of a phenomenological encounter and intuitive apprehension. It's a lot of words, but again, it's the encounter with a painting, with a sculpture, with language, with thinking about the way you're experiencing language, thinking about the way you're experiencing space when you relate to that, and really kind of going into an imaginative, connective participation with consciousness and with works of art. So, as I mentioned, Gebser started all of this through his interest in poetry and how poetry was transforming in the 20th century. And I suppose it would have been in the German language. And he started with Rilke in Spain. And just sort of going, to give you an example, and again, this is just an example, he's talking about the transformation of adjectives, shifting between the importance of objects to the emphasis of the relationship between objects in a sentence in language. It is employed in a way that it takes effect in all directions, he says. The notion of objects has lost its significance, together with perspectivity achieved through the use of adverbs, by which objects were meant to be deepened or interpreted according to the viewpoint of the observer. What is gaining importance now is the spiritual light reigning between objects, the tension and the relation between them. And he's talking about language and I suppose nouns in language, in English, the relation between nouns, between objects in a sentence. But really, this is sort of an encapsulation of what he's going to be talking about when he starts looking at other things. And he's talking about specifically the transformation of our contemporary time of the 20th century and the late 19th century. But this kind of helps him. So really, it starts with the language. It starts with understanding the current transformation, and ever-present origin is kind of like going down the rabbit hole. It's starting with this interest in Rilke and new poetry and this new consciousness that seems to be emerging in the arts in Europe, and then it goes leaves the question, well, if this is changing now, have there been other changes? Where are we changing from? And what were those structures of consciousness like? What was it like to be in the world 1,000 years ago? What was different? So that sort of, the rabbit hole that ever-present origin is, it kind of opens up consciousness, kind of opens up the structures to begin to be explored and qualitatively described. So some helpful temporaries that you might want to look at here would be Owen Barfield, Saving the Appearances, a study in idolatry and poetic diction, a study in meaning. But Owen Barfield in general was one of the inklings with C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. And he was very interested in the evolution of language as well, and very specifically about that. He was an English writer, so he was sort of looking more at the English language. But I highly recommend that as well. And the second ones are not as much about linguistics, but they can be, at least Whitehead, and Process and Reality. And he's talking about the shift from materialism to organic realism, to process, to movement. And again, if you go back to this about the relationship between objects, there's almost a kind of movement here. There's a kind of dynamism here. And what you see in the early 20th century is this kind of interest moving away from the sort of static Newtonian reality and into a very dynamic understanding of time, of objects, of the relationship between objects, complexity, movement. Henri Bergson is another one who I highly recommend. Matter and Memory, of course, but Creative Evolution as well. And interestingly, Henri Bergson is somebody who went on to really influence Teilhard de Chardin, who we'll be talking about more in the second class as sort of one of Gebser's peers here. So we're getting a sense of phenomenology, we're getting a sense of the structures, but what the heck is origin, right? So let's first start with what the structures are, and that's going to lead right into origin. So as we're saying, the structures are these qualitative dimensions of time and space and world that we can sort of glean or intuit through works of art, through history, through language, etc. It has temporal qualities. These could be temporicity, a timelessness, dream versus waking senses of time. They could be spatial qualities. They could be 0 dimensions up to the 4th dimension, maybe beyond. Spiritual qualities. And Gebser mentions this many times, that the structures aren't necessarily, from the 14th century until the 18th century, this structure was, that was the structure. They're more spiritual, they're more intangible, they're more qualitative, descriptive, and intuitive, and therefore shouldn't necessarily be kind of pegged into a historical linear timeline. Even though there's a kind of unfolding that happens through history. And we're going to go into that a little bit more later. But the structures mutate and they express themselves. They're fulfilled through human consciousness. He calls this concretized. So we're going to go into this as well, what it means to concretize something. So Rilke would be a good example through his poetry and sort of concretizing this new consciousness. The structures emerge in consciousness through crisis and breakdown. And they happen in a discontinuous way. So they happen through leaps, these kind of creative leaps of artists, physicists, scientists, engineers, anybody and everybody that seem to become sort of possessed by a new way of being in the world and move this thing into being. It's a very kind of spontaneous thing. And again, nonlinear. Okay, so now origin. So for Gebser, origin is ever present. It is not beginning, since all beginning is linked with time. And the present is not just the now, the today, the moment or a unit of time. It is the ever originating, an achievement of full integration and continuous renewal. Anyone able to concretize, i.e. to realize the effect, the reality of origin and the present in their entirety, supersedes beginning and end and the mere here and now. You might notice a lot of this is describing something related to time or timelessness, or just simply out of time, not necessarily, as we'll see, against time, against linearity, against the passing of time, but something that sort of sees through time, something that is what he would call, eventually we're going to go into this, the achronon. So origin, it's a very mystical kind of understanding or apprehension of what consciousness is. And, I would say that Gebser himself was a kind of intuitive, mystical scholar. He had this sense of origin, and he was writing from this sense of there being this ever-present origin. And so, I think you could kind of you can consider him an intellectual mystic. And it's good to kind of go into this with that in mind. He's not necessarily one of these secular secular Western philosophers trying to talk about time and being, but shying away from the spiritual dimensions. He's really kind of present with that, and it's present in him. So let's see. Perspectivity is something we're going to be getting into now. And so really before the structures of consciousness in Gebser's writing were really established, and we're going to go into those, he was using these: the pre-perspectival, the unperspectival, and the aperspectival. And these are used to describe, as we're saying, as a kind of primer for understanding the unfolding dimensions of space and time in the structures. So yeah, it's a broad brush, but this is actually how Gebser writes in Ever-Present Origin. The first pages really are going into perspectivity, and then he introduces each of the structures. And so our talk here is going to go through the same sort of approach, because I just felt it was the most sensible to kind of try to unpack everything, because there's quite a lot to unpack, and the book itself is a massive tome, as you've seen, and there's so much in there, and is drawing from so many different disciplines, not just study of language, study of phenomenology and ontology and poetry, but he's looking at the sciences as well. He's looking at so many different dimensions and disciplines. It really is a transdisciplinary work, and it's written again from that sense of origin and presence. So there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot to kind of, if you are to read this book and not just watch the presentation, if you want to, then I would recommend just giving yourself time to really digest it, to work with it, to live with it, to have a relationship with it, to kind of unfold these things and kind of talk back to it, in your own experience. And we're going to be going into that as well. So yeah, Gebser also writes right at the beginning: clearly discernible worlds stand out, whose development or unfolding took place in mutations of consciousness. And he begins with the pre-perspectival world. So if you will, we're going to be kind of going through a little journey together. And as we go through that, remember the phenomenology that we talked about. Remember those questions, those orienting questions, and how to ask yourself what you're experiencing with these things. Ask yourself how these things apply to your own experience of time and space, and perhaps even in a more primordial way, as we're going to be going to these sort of primordial origins. Perhaps, what your own consciousness has to say about these things. So, of course, the pre-perspectival goes way, way, way back. And as we'll go into, this is going to be the sort of archaic magic structure, but we're not going to be going into a lot of details about what that specifically means. We're going to stick with the pre-perspectival right now. So, perspective is sort of a sense of space, right? So there's more of an emphasis on space in this word. So in the Lascaux cave, for instance, this is around 17,000 years old, perhaps older. I don't know. We're always finding older things with quote unquote prehistory. This, as you see, the expression of the artist is such that there isn't necessarily a realistic dimensionality to the animals. They change in shape, they overlap with each other, they kind of merge with each other, and the sense of the cave itself is important as well as this kind of primordial consciousness. There's another one. This is Chauvet Cave, about 30,000 BC, or BP now. I wrote that down in the little note there before present. So I guess it's a new temporal denotation. But again, you can especially see that here in the kind of merging between the animals. And there's a kind of implied movement, which I think is interesting. There's a kind of dimensionality to them. And we kind of carry this with us as we move into from these hunter-gatherer societies that had special locations for sacred ritual, like these caves were. They were not places where we lived. They were places where we went for some form of ritual or another. And we're still trying to understand these rituals. It's very difficult to, as you can imagine. It requires a very rigorous scientific approach, but also, I think, and what Gebser might say, a very phenomenological approach. And I'm going to recommend this, and I'll mention it outright as a little assignment for you to really get an experience of this. It's to watch The Cave of Forgotten Dreams on Netflix by Werner Herzog. It's a documentary. I think it's about 2 hours long, and it's a very experiential documentary, and it kind of just sort of, I recommend watching it at night, turning off the lights, putting on headphones, or having a good sound system, and just really, really kind of tuning into it. So, because it really kind of brings you into this kind of world as cave, which is what we're going to be talking about. And you can see how this kind of world as cave, this kind of world imaginary as cave moves into, for instance, some of the very early settlements like in Catalhuyuk, which I think is in modern day Turkey. But what's interesting about this is that these settlements had the inhabitants actually climb up to the roof in order to descend down into the home. And interestingly, also within the home, in the bedrooms in these settlements, the ancestors were buried. So you would go to sleep in your bedroom, but underneath your bed where you slept, the dead also slept. So there's a kind of interesting connection to the underworld, to the cave, and it sort of is carried on and retrieved into some of the very early settlements. This is written about more explicitly through John David Ebert's work, and some of his essays, if you're interested, and William Irwin Thompson's work in Self and Society. And it's actually a specific one about the evolution of the afterlife that I definitely recommend. But even the signs, images of the bull and the hunt are very present here. You can see a lot kind of carried over from this cavern-like consciousness where perspectivity and realism and three-dimensionality weren't as significant. What was significant was these kind of sympathetic resonance with things, and the prevalence of the animistic world of the animal and the cave as world. So then we kind of shift, and this is a big shift, but I'm kind of doing what Gebser did in his book, jumping from the pre-perspectival to the unperspectival. So this is kind of this is sort of before what we would imagine today, with the Renaissance painting and realistic landscapes. This is before we had really a sense or a consciousness that was interested in depicting that world, and more interested in the kind of spiritual realities, the symbolic realities, the world of the soul, for instance, and the world of the cave are both very important, especially in medieval period, as you can see that sort of retrieved here. The cave is retrieved. You're going to get into that again in a moment. So here is another aspect, and I'm only kind of mentioning it here to kind of make a connection with how this carries over into your early city-states. But I won't necessarily comment on why this is such a common motif across the world, Korea, India, and Ireland, the dolmen architecture. But Gebser mentions this as sort of the other side, the other aspect that was really important in those times, the cave, and then these kind of pillars, kind of phallic pillars. And he makes an association between the masculine and the feminine. I'm not exactly sure, but there's certainly some evidence there to relate those two. And of course, here you bring them together, the cave and the pillars. And the cave and the pillars themselves kind of work with the stalagmite and stalactite of this sort of primordial physical cave. So there's a kind of interesting connection there in seeing the cave as cathedral or the cathedral as cave. This is from Spain in the 10th century. And again, you can almost bring this medieval image of the cave and the kind of consciousness that has, and sort of link that back to Chauvet and Lassault in terms of the paintings on the ceiling and so on. So something interesting starts to happen in the unperspectival world, in the world as cave, which kind of carries forth from our primordial origins and continues forward, not only to medieval times, but just a lot of early civilizations. And it's this sort of sense of this sort of symbolic world, the domed world. And this is a perfect example from Fra Angelico, who was sort of at the cusp. And we're going to see another one of his images later that painted later in his life. He was one of the individuals who kind of straddled the border between the pre-perspectival, the unperspectival, and the perspectival. And perspective is where we start to get a more three-dimensional and realistic sense of the world. But before then, it was the world as cave. And I think this is a great example that, there's a light that's shining in, but it's a transcendent light, with an angel or a dove in that beam. And this is the Annunciation of Mary here, where, announcing that she's going to have Christ. And if you could see, neither of these characters are very, in the depiction, realistically painted. It kind of looks like, if Mary stood up, she might hit her head a little bit on the ceiling there. The sense of depth is not as realistic, although it is kind of present there. And then, of course, the outdoors is not what we would perceive as, a real garden, but the symbolic garden of Adam and Eve. And you see Adam and Eve leaving there. There's a kind of symbolic consciousness, a rich symbolic consciousness through which the world is perceived, where we're not as interested, or we haven't as concretized space and three-dimensional space, and what we would again see later on with the Renaissance. And again, here's Gebser describing this kind of world as cave. Yet spaceless, self-contained, and depthless world, significant for its symbolic content and not for what we would today call its realism. These pictures of an unperspectival era are, as it were, painted at night when objects are without shadow and depth. Here darkness has swallowed space to the extent that only the immaterial, psychic component could be expressed. And, I think that sums it up pretty well, what you see here, and how you can link that back to some of these more primordial structures of understanding consciousness. So then we kind of move into the perspectival world out of the cave. So I recommend reading this part of the book. It's towards the beginning of Ever-Present Origin, and really any kind of work about sort of the emergence of perspective. It's very interesting to kind of see early artists. And again, it's the artists, not necessarily the physicists or the scientists, as it were, who were exploring these things. It's usually the mystics and the artists who kind of pioneer this in some kind of intuitive gleaning. They're sort of possessed by this new structure. And you see, especially in Ever-Present Origin, Gebser talks about all of these early painters and sculptors and monks and who are wrestling with perspective, and they're wrestling with trying to kind of add a sense of depth to the painting and so on. Still very much a symbolic expression, but nevertheless they're attempting to depict this. And I have to mention too that it's not linear. There's examples of perspectivity that go back to the Roman period, and there's examples of perspectivity that are beyond just Western history, as we're kind of going through the Mediterranean and and Western civilization right now. But Gebser was writing this at a time when he didn't have access to as much depth of world history, and also very limited access to some of the biases of the time, which was more world history was Western history back then, and it certainly wasn't. But so if you see a little bit more of the kind of a Western centric, that is because Gebser himself was admittedly, even he forthright about, in Ever-Present Origin, he mentions Sri Aurobindo as sort of, go read Sri Aurobindo, because my writing is only for what he called the Occident. This was just my attempt to understanding what was happening with Western civilization, and a necessary cross analysis would have to occur with future writers and so on. So kind of just want to put that in there. So he's describing perspective, a new awareness of psychic awareness of space, objectified or externalized from the psyche out into the world begins, a consciousness of space whose element of depth becomes visible in perspective. And with perspectivity comes all of these other things that start coming online, as it were, around the same time. He mentions the troubadours and the usage of I in their poetry as a kind of early, again, artistic form of intuiting this new structure. The retreat of the psychical world into the domain of the unconscious. And this gets more explicitly expressed when we get to psychology in the late 19th century. But I think it's nevertheless important to kind of understand that seeing the world as this kind of symbolic reality like we have here, it retreats as we begin to become interested in the world as material, as perspective, as we see here. the emergence of humanism and man is the measure of all things, the emphasis on individuality and the subjective self. We might correspond this to what we mentioned earlier about Marshall McLuhan and media studies, and mention that the invention of the printing press, the transformations of language were taking place here. And if you want to go a little bit earlier back, the shift from oral to script culture in terms of being able to write down things and remember things and break language down from a very acoustic embodied experience to an alphabetic experience also kind of helped this sort of emphasis of the subjective self. And then the printing press, of course, did that even more, beginning to see the world as text and technicality and machination and technology and those sorts of things. The importance of the eye in perspective in naturalism. And, the lens and the microscope and the telescope all kind of came together. We could start to use the eye, the shift from the ear and acoustics and embodiment to the eye as a very big thing. And we're going to go into that later as well. But we're beginning to get a realistic sense of the world, both microscopically and macroscopically, with things like heliocentrism. All these things are rapidly kind of asserting themselves in all of these different discoveries. And again, it's the artists, and I haven't really shown too many, but again, read the book and check out some of these early artists. Look at Da Vinci's work, look at these early Renaissance painters, and study the early humanists, and kind of get a sense that these were radically new things. And of course, the development of linear time, Westminster Palace, and the monks, Christian monks, use that as a kind of way to keep time, and that kind of mechanism is carried forward as well. So this is a famous kind of experiential image for you. And this is the famous Francesco Petrarch, who some of you may be familiar with. I think he's a famous humanist, or he's considered a famous humanist. He writes a letter to I believe it's his priest or perhaps his bishop, after climbing a mountain. And he's a painter as well. And he wanted to go paint the landscape. And you have to understand that painting a landscape wasn't something that people just did back then for fun. The fact that we didn't always do that is very interesting. What was it about this older consciousness that didn't have that sense of space and time that we do? He's credited for the discovery of this of landscape. And he's in France, and he's climbing this site, which Gebser also mentions is geographically related to the troubadours, the Gnostic Cathars, and the Albigensi. And he describes gnosis as sort of an interesting thing. And gnosis, again, is a sort of individual self realization, spiritual realization. So he's low key kind of implying there's a kind of Gnostic ascent in this. At least that's how I'm interpreting his writing of it. But in climbing this mountain, Petrarch, and you can read the letter, and I'm going to quote from it, he has this kind of spiritual experience. He has this kind of, as it were, a peak experience on this mountain of the landscape and the beauty of the landscape. And he writes this narrative with his priest, his probably Catholic priest, talking to the priest in the letter, saying, he felt guilty to have such a spiritual appreciation of the material world, where he should be more interested on the sort of interior dimensions of the soul and of the kind of religious imagination rather than the material imagination. But Gebser describes this as a kind of, the unperspectival ties are severed and with space as reality. So here is Petrarch, as translated by Gebser, an ever-present origin, describing this. Shaken by the unaccustomed wind and the wide, freely... Gosh, sorry, 1 second. Trying to... one moment, folks. Just can't read it. He says, shaken by the unaccustomed wind and the wide, freely shifting vistas, I was immediately awestruck. God and my companion are witnesses that my glance fell upon the passage. And men went forth to behold the high mountains and the mighty surge of the sea and the broad stretches of the rivers and the inexhaustible ocean and the paths of the stars, and doing so lose themselves in wonderment. I was irritated for having turned my thoughts to mundane matters at such a moment, for even the pagan philosophers should have long taught me that there is nothing more wondrous than the soul, and that compared to its greatness, nothing is great. So again, there's this image of him climbing this mountain and feeling guilty for having an experience of space in such a profoundly mystical way. And I wanted to share this, and perhaps we can do that now for an experiential moment. And let me just share that part of the screen again. And if anybody has any questions, I see a few people have raised their hands. Just let me know in the chat box or the Q&A box. As always, I can read your questions there. It's kind of hard to respond to the specific raised hand. But yes, definitely do that. And if you have any questions as we go along, please just leave them in the Q&A box or the chat box. Any observations? I see Dave has mentioned something interesting, making a connection with another integral scholar, Bruce Alderman, integral indwelling, and Sophia Speaks about the Rilke in Spain. Very interesting. I'd love to unpack that later, David, with you if you want to comment on that some more. Okay, so I'm going to share screen again, and we're going to play a little multimedia here to add a little bit more of an experiential dimension for us. Okay, so this is a drone footage, I believe, of Mount Ventoux. And just to kind of get you that experience, contemplate the sense that we are emerging from the world as cave, that this kind of symbolic religious imagination is withdrawing as space, as perspectival space is emerging, and a sense of beauty and awe in that, which many of us can, I think, relate to and understand naturally as moderns. And I'm going to play this, interestingly, alongside the Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Let me just share that again with the audio. Here we go. All right. And I'll be back with you in another minute or two. We'll do this for about 2 minutes. we go. That was Mount Ventoux from a drone. And I hope everybody could see that okay. Just let me know again if there's any technical issues with the presentation. Now we're going to hop back to the slides. Here we go. So, on that note, as you know, as Petrarch has this experience, Gebser comments, "The old world where only the soul is wonderful and worthy of contemplation, as expressed succinctly in Augustine's words, time resides in the soul, now begins to collapse. There is a gradual but increasing evident shift from time to space until the soul wastes away in the materialism of the 19th century, a loss obvious to most today that only the most recent generations have begun to counter in new ways." And I do think he's talking about some of the countercultures of the 50s and 60s there. And here is another example now of Fra Angelico, Annunciation, but this is a later painting. Notice the fence there. There's no Garden of Eden behind them in the outdoors, but a more realistic kind of garden, encapsulated by a fence. And there is no beam of heavenly light that comes down. And there's more of a sense of space because if you look, there is a window now in the back. There's a sense of depth that goes right into the garden. It may not exactly be perfect. You can kind of see that the fence should overlap a little through that window. But nevertheless, there's now this new sense of space. Kind of looks like they can both stand up without bumping their heads. There's no more domed stars, as you will, but just a simple shading there. So there's a kind of sense now that the only thing that's supernatural in this image is really the angel, and perhaps the spiritual halos here as a sort of symbolic significance. But again, this is a sort of transitional piece, moving into the perspectival world. And we also have things like Leon Battista Alberti della Pittura, and this is perspective theory book. And a lot of artists tend to write these sort of manifesto theory books that posit this new way of relating and perhaps give instructions, perhaps are just sort of declarations. And this is more of a kind of, all right, here's how you do perspective. Because at one point, this was a breakthrough in artistic movements and in perspectival consciousness. This was all new. So then again, Gebser is going into this sort of whole gestalt of things that are happening. Copernicus shadows the limits of the geocentric sky with heliocentric space. There's Columbus, of course, who goes around the world, I guess, or tries to at least, and discovers the Americas. But again, it's this new sense that the world isn't flat, that the world is this sphere. Vesalius, the first major anatomist, he bursts the confines of Galen's ancient doctrines on the human body and discovers the body's space. So even the space of the body as an anatomical being is beginning to be realized with the modern sciences and medicine. Harvey destroys the receipts of Hippocrates' humoral medicine, so throwing out the humors and revealing the circulatory system. And then Kepler, who demonstrates the elliptical orbit of the planets. He overthrows antiquity's unperspectival world image of the circular and flat surfaces that dated back to Ptolemy's conception of the circular movement of the planets. So I'd like to emphasize, though, that, especially in the consciousness culture, we are looking back at these older symbolic intuitive ways of understanding nature that are symbolic and imaginative and correspondent with certain insights and intuitive insights. Those things are real. It's just that when we have become more possessed by this sense of three-dimensional space, and three-dimensional space kind of being exclusively real to the detriment of other ways of seeing and being in the world, other structures. And we're going to go into that too, that these structures, they may be false when you say that the world isn't literally flat, or the world, the human body doesn't have this kind of intuitive energetic system. Perhaps it does, but you're not seeing it necessarily through the mental structure in order to appreciate that. So further developments here, just really quickly. Galileo, heliocentrism. There's colonialism, the rise of the merchant class. There's the fragmentation, which is an interesting aspect of this new consciousness. Fragmentation. So Christianity fragments with Protestantism and hundreds of different segments and sects of the church. There's emancipatory movements as well. So it's not just sort of infighting, but this kind of liberation, sort of liberatory spirit in democratic movements, and the shift from the feudal monarchs to these more dynamic, mercantile, and legalistic forms of nation states. But at the same time, as Gebser mentions, there's ego hypertrophy, the exaggeration of the I, rather than the kind of appreciation and healthy understanding of the self. There's this sort of hyper ego, this ego hypertrophy. So, and again, an overemphasis on space and the objective reality. Reality ceases to be this sort of symbolic world, and it moves into this, it moves from transparent to opaque. And the opaque is what begins to interest us, because we've never really looked at that exclusively before. This is just Gebser talking about how this kind of movement to ego hypertrophy and the overemphasis on the self and the splitting of all of these different movements. He's talking about the fragmentation of religion, the ascendancy of nation states, separate individual states. And he says this process of segmentation led to the contemporary state of narrow specialization and the great achievements of the man with tunnel vision. And there is no going back. The ties to the past, the religio, are almost non-existent, having been severed, as it were, by the cutting edge of the visual pyramid. And we're going to get into the visual pyramid a little bit later. But if you look at this, that's the visual pyramid. That's perspective. It's seeing the plane of space and seeing it disappear into the physical event horizon. And so again, the importance of the I here for this type of consciousness is coming to the forefront. But that's not everything that's happening. There's a lot more going on. And as we move into the 20th century, some of these new aspects, this aperspectival world, begins to emerge. And a big aspect of this is the concretion of time. And he writes, only where time emerges as pure present and is no longer divided into its three phases of past, present, and future is it concrete. And so what's important here, I think, is the understanding that as we're moving through the 19th century and moving through perspective and the realization of perspective and sciences and all the things mentioned, we're now kind of entering into a time where time begins to assert itself. So we're moving from the realization of space to the realization of time. So this is contemporary of Gebser's as well, and I believe he corresponded with Picasso a bit. And Picasso, he was very interested in, and again, this was drawn in 1926 to us. We've seen it so many times and in museums and so on. And it's kind of like, well, what's so interesting about this? Again, it's the sense that of when this emerged and what it was doing with painting, what it was doing with a sense of time and space, was very radical. And if you read it like Gebser reads it, it's a good way to kind of go, okay, so how is this continuing to happen? What is the intensification going on? So he's talking about this painting, and really, like, again, here's a way for us to really kind of begin to encounter things through these images. Really kind of look at the dynamics of this woman and her face, and it looks as if she's facing you, but she's also facing away. There's an implication of movement. So he's saying in this drawing, space and body have become transparent, in the sense that it's neither unperspectival, like two-dimensional rendering of the surface in which the body is imprisoned, nor is it perspectival, a three-dimensional visual vector cut out of reality that surrounds the figure breathing space. The drawing is aperspectival in our sense of the term. Time is no longer spatialized, but integrated and concretized as a fourth dimension. This image is showing time. This renders the whole visible to insight, a whole which becomes visible only because the previously missing component, time, is expressed in an intensified and valid form as the present, the pure present, the quintessence of time that radiates from this drawing. So time is what's being expressed here, is being concretized here and explored by these early painters such as Picasso. There's other artists, Jean Metzinger, Salvador Dali, that we can mention, kind of explore here, how they kind of also look at these things. They also look at psychology and the unconscious, of course, with surrealism. A perspectival art, he mentions a few of these: expressionism, cubism, fauvism, surrealism. breaking forth from the constrictions of perspectival space. And remember what we said earlier about it's no longer about the objects, but the relationship between the objects. And what better way to express that than temporal relations? The one on the left here is broken up, but there's a kind of intensity of relationship between the woman and her space. It denotes many different dimensions of meaning, significance, and symbol, of course, as you see on the right. Quite a interesting image there. Geopoliticus child watching the birth of a new man. We can kind of unpack that for a whole session if we really wanted to. So the intensities and the spiritual presence returns, and it's the spiritual light reigning between objects. So this is sort of a criteria here for this new aperspectival. Essentially, to the extent that language itself, this is Gebser, in word and sentence is treated as a primordial phenomenon by recognizing the originating creative nature. Psychically, insofar as extrinsic plot yields to what is called stream of consciousness. Thematically, insofar as poetry begins to deal explicitly with the time problem, and structurally, insofar as a new estimation of grammatical aspects and a novel use of syntactical freedom are evident. So he's describing this sort of breaking free of space into this higher dimensionality of relation, of time, of presence, of multi-dimensional being. So that's how he begins the book. That's just the beginning of the book. And then we're going to go into the structures, which will circle back a little bit. But now we have the pre, the un, and now perspectival, and now the aperspectival. That's helped us that's the fundamentals, right? And before Gebser really went into the new integral structure, he had to understand the old. So here we can kind of loop around and kind of go through the spiral, as it were, come back and sort of get in touch with the particular structures as we go through this. So we already mentioned about origin and consciousness. We've already mentioned Rilke in Spain. I mentioned here, Gebser also uses origin synonymously with spiritual in the itself. Now, all of these structures are latent in origin, the past, present, and future. And as we mentioned, they spring forth through these mutations. And as you mentioned, mutations are not linear. They're discontinuous. They live in us and they do not go away. So as you go through these, kind of note that and see how these things are still, they are not necessarily a geological layer of your being that sort of like a reptilian brainstem, for instance, or kind of the older layers of the brain. While they have some aspects of that, they still are very much present and can assert themselves, especially when another structure is trying to suppress them. So keep that in mind. And let's see here. Yeah, consciousness mutations are completions of integration. And here is a thing that might be worth mentioning before we get to the structures. They're not developmental. Now, there might be an unfolding, as Gebser is mentioning, of a notion which admits the participation of a spiritual reality in mutation. But under no circumstances is this form of development to be considered progress. Progress is not a positive concept, even when mindlessly construed to be one. Progress is also a progression away, a distancing and withdrawing from something, namely origin. So I'll just let that speak for itself there. But very easily these things can be misconstrued into a developmental map. And really, if you do that, as we will see, the linearity is a very much a perspectival way of kind of understanding these things rather than an aperspectival. So yeah, each mutation is a gain in dimensionality, but is also an impoverishment, as we will see, because these can be a stepping away from that originary consciousness. So there's a kind of tension through the structural mutations. And here they are. Here's what you've been waiting for, the structures of consciousness. Archaic, magic, mythic, mental, and integral. Now, the archaic, the magic, and the mythical are all within that kind of pre-perspectival, unperspectival. And the mental is that sort of surging forth of the perspectival consciousness. And of course, the integral is the aperspectival. So we begin with the archaic. And not a lot is really able to be said here. Because the archaic is sort of synonymous with origin. And because of that, it's really hard to kind of descriptively say at what point in history these things were there. But nevertheless, there's a few qualities that we can take with us. It's zero-dimensional, from the Greek arche, it's inception or origin. The complete non-differentiation of man and universe. And again, that sort of idea, dreamlessly the men of earlier times slept. And I believe that is a quote from a Taoist writer, a Taoist text that I'm not familiar with at the moment, but I can get that for you later. There is the mythical illusion Gebser mentions with the androgyne, the primal proto-anthropus, non-differentiation of archaic humanity and the world and universe, the dormancy of the soul and latency. Now, for me, if you were going to ask, when would you really say that this structure was in history? If we had to give a timeline, if we had to associate that, I would probably say, and again, this is so messy because if you look at anthropology and you look at evolutionary history, we really don't know when human creativity surged forth, but some of the earliest artistic expressions in human art and Homo sapiens is 50 to 40,000 years ago in Upper Paleolithic. So if we were going to say something leapt forth, or something sprung forth between sort of early tool making and this kind of surge of creative, artistic, magical numinosity of the early human consciousness, there are interesting records in archaeology and anthropology about that, about how it kind of pops up on the radar suddenly. So maybe we could say somewhere around there, this kind of creative surgence, which relates again to the sense of mutation as a kind of leap. And just to kind of tie in Owen Barfield here and his concept of original participation, kind of a synonymous idea of this sort of fusing with human consciousness and world. Here is the just a Greek image of the Aristophanes. The myth of Aristophanes is this sort of androgynous being that split into genders and into humanity, but originally was a kind of the image of the soul as this whole being, which is non-differentiated. So that's all we can say really about that, I think, at the moment. But with magic, that's where we can really kind of place our roots down and begin to connect with it. So it's actually linked to the etymology of make, or mechanism, or machine, or might. And Gebser writes, this is no longer about being in the world, but of having the world. There's a single dimensionality, and one point stands for the whole. So he uses these points as a way to kind of understand dimensions. So for the magic, it's one point is all points. And this is sort of a magical consciousness of reality. So Magic Man's reality is a system of associations, or these individual objects, deeds, or events separated from one another, like points in the overall unity. This is where, in the concept of magic, it's sympathetic resonance, where a particular ritual in the present has everything to do with the hunt tomorrow, or some kind of magical act in reality where all things are linked with all other things. And so to do something in the present is to do a spell, is literally to kind of write reality, if we're going to kind of take a magical, literary magic sense here. So in one microcosm is the whole, and the whole is the microcosm. You work with natural forces and animals and magical rituals, and you participate with nature. So it's no longer, as some people might say, a fusion between human consciousness and nature, which I think is a false way of understanding this earlier consciousness, this early structure. But a relationship with it. You're working with these things. You're using magical techniques. You're working in a kind of symbolic relationship of power, of not necessarily control in a bad way, but mastery with these energetic forces, with animal forces, with the powers of nature, and so on. And Gebser says this consciousness is egoless. It's more about the group consciousness, trance states, and merging. There's theories. Gebser was writing about this at the time, and a lot of people were, and we might even say a lot of magical writers today say this, that particular states of psychic activity and intuition have everything to do with this structure as well. The ability to kind of intuit things and to feel it in your gut. Gebser writes that the magic is all about the gut and the mind of the gut and its feeling and apprehension of reality through that. Spaceless and timeless, and in the sense that there's not as much of a sense of the passing of time. But I would say here, it's really hard to pinpoint that because, a lot of ancient societies, I am sure, if we look at the paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet, they were looking at the stars and they had a sense of rhythmicity. So even this is not purely timeless and spaceless. Even this has a sense of quality of time. But yeah, vital energies, interdependence. It's just another image from Lascaux Cave of some kind of interesting. A lot have been written about this, but hunting a buffalo or a bison. There's this duck-headed shaman-looking guy with a strange duck staff, possibly an erection. The bison has been hit. There's a kind of trance state in all of this, whatever is going on here. So again, it's this kind of sympathetic resonance between humanity and the rest of nature. And the prevalence of animals in our consciousness, this is before city-states, this is before any of that. So the kind of symbolic imagination and religious imagination of the magic had everything to do with what we would consider today the natural environment, which for them was simply the environment, which was, their reality, their phenomenology. So we already have this. This is another image, but this comes back here of this kind of interconnecting, interlinking forms and animals in which you go to the ritual and perhaps you commune with these beings through some kind of initiatic state. And Gebser writes, all magic, even today, occurs in the natural, vital, the egoless, spaceless, and timeless sphere. This requires a sacrifice of consciousness. And I think he means for today, not for them. But for us, who has an ego, we have to kind of get through that. We're not used to going into these altered states, to having this kind of fluidity, although that is changing now, I'm going to argue, when we get into the contemporary world. It occurs in a state of trance, or when consciousness dissolves as a result of mass reactions, slogans, or isms. We are not aware of this sphere in ourselves. If we're not aware, it remains an entry for all kinds of magic influences. So you go a little further into your earlier civilizations, and some of the motifs. Now, again, motifs are important because they may be everywhere, but they're pointing to something about everything, about our whole Umwelt, our whole state of being, our life world. So a motif in a lot of ancient paintings and images is this kind of interlinking two-dimensional connection with everything. So images are painted in such a way like this. This isn't the best example, but Gebser does mention this painting. It's a fresco in the Palace of Popes, I think in France. And it's a whole wall, really, and it's humans interlinking in this kind of natural symbolic environment. But again, it's a sort of interlinking of symbol and nature and self that are fused, as it were, in the vines of this sort of magical consciousness, but stays with us, I think, as a motif as we enter the mythical. And before we get to the mythical, this is probably one more good example of how to kind of tune into the magical. And Gebser writes that, the magical is more about hearing and acoustics. And again, think back to the acoustics of the cave. Language is important, but language as an embodied auditory experience of vibration and sensorium. Language as something that you're hearing the profundity of nature and the sounds of nature. The text that you read is not a text; it's an auditory soundscape of image, presence, intelligence, communication. So language is important, communication and sound is important, and that's at least why Gebser believes that some of the motifs of the magic don't have mouths, because it's more important to hear. It's more important to listen. And it kind of looks like these guys on the left look like Greys, aliens from our time, and some funny people talking about that. But it also kind of looks like a mouth, but I believe they're meant to be noses here, as you can see. And that's from actually cave paintings in Australia, and Venus of Brassempois, I believe, is in France. And this motif pops up very frequently in the magical structure during this sort of prehistorical time period. Yeah, so Gebser, just reiterating what I said, the importance and significance is on sound and sounds in nature. In any event, the lack of a mouth is a sign that for Magic Man, the organ that enables us to articulate is still irrelevant. Communication between members of the group ego, the we, does not yet require language, but occurs to a certain extent subcutaneously or telepathically. The egolessness of the individual, who is not yet an individual, demands participation and communication on the basis of the collective and vital intentions. The inseparable bonds of the clan are the dominant principle, or tribe, as you were. But it's interesting that, as moderns, we're interested in reconnecting with these things, so bringing these things back online through different forms of technological ritual, through trance and the sort of 1960s consciousness culture and counterculture. These things are, as we'll see, they wish to be integrated. They don't. You can't suppress them or ignore them or focus on one structure over another without there being some kind of unhealthy tension and dynamism. So again, think back to the cave. It is not the sun-related eye, but the labyrinthine ear that is the magic organ. The sun represents diurnal brightness, whereas the labyrinth represents the cave-like nocturnal darkness of dormant consciousness. So that's magic. Then we move into mythic, and mythic is a little bit more about time, a little bit more about the soul. As we mentioned, there's some overlap here. There's no clear-cut delineation between these two. That's easy to discern. But mythic is about the movement, the calendrical systems, the rhythms of nature, the rhythms of the human body as it connects to nature, the sort of embodied and symbolic presence of natural cycles and seasons and temporicity. So we can think of astrological calendrical systems. We can think of hunter-gatherers moving into settlements and emphasizing more the qualitative passage of time and the symbolic meaning of those passages of time with earlier myths, and further differentiation from nature. So this is a great example here. Now, this is the prince with a crown of feathers from Kronos and Gnosis, Gnosis, Crete, and is from about 1500 BC. And Gebser brings this up. Actually, the image in Ever-Present Origin is a little different, in that mountain behind him or ledge is more of it covers the whole horizon, even behind him, behind his body. It doesn't stop at his body. But you can see in a kind of symbolic reading, and again, this is a good example of Gebser's kind of intuitive brilliance with some of the paintings and images he works with, that, half of this man, this prince, his body is standing in this vegetative consciousness, and the other half is standing in the stars, as it were, in the sky. And so there's more of this kind of emphasis of the soul and the stars and rhythmicity, and the flight. Of course, a bird is a very common motif across many different cultures of the soul. He has a sort of crown of feathers. There's this movement out of this sort of embedded diffusion with nature and into this sort of symbolic, astrological, and rhythmic, mythical consciousness. So etymology, the word myth actually is related to the word mouth and mythos. It means speech or word, to report, but it also is related etymologically to mu, to sound. But a close word to it, mien, means to be silent. So there's a polarity in the mythical structure as well, and the polarities are earth and heaven, sky and the underworld. And as you see here, this vegetative consciousness and now the consciousness of the sky and the stars. So there's a polarity. There's not necessarily, they're not against each other. They're very often complementary rhythms and cycles of light and dark. And that's really a big part of this, really big part of this. And Gebser writes that the world is always a mirror of inner silence and a myth, a reflector of soul. The blind or unreflective side of the mirror is necessary to produce the visible. Since all psychic phenomena have essentially reflective character, they not only evidence natural temporality, but also make reference to the sky. The soul reflects the sky as well as hell. I'm not sure how he's linking that, but interesting. Thus, the circle is complete. Time, soul, myth, hell and heaven, myth, soul, time. The mythical structure, whose unperspectival two-dimensionality has a latent predisposition to perspectivity, has an imaginatory consciousness reflected in the imagistic nature of myth and responsive to the soul and sky of the ancient cosmos. So, within this, there, as we understand in a lot of Greek myths and also in the Bhagavad Gita, there's the kind of creation of the self. And we also look at this, and again, I recommend Coming Into Being, Artifacts and Texts and the Evolution of Consciousness by William Irwin Thompson. because he's looking at some of these myths too, and how the separation from the cosmos and just sort of diffused consciousness with nature, moving into the city states and the settlements, developing a new conception of time, perhaps developing written language and hieroglyphs and more of a symbolic separation, so that civilization becomes the Umwelt, the life world. There's a separation that starts to take place, which is a good metaphor for the separation of the self and nature and city state and the ego. But also directedness. The self begins to emerge through wrath. And this is an interesting thing that Gebser brings in too. Wrath and anger in mythology and the manifestation of the hero. Think Gilgamesh and Enkidu fighting these ancient forest gods and goddesses and sort of defiling those old rituals and setting forth to gain immortality for themselves and failing to do so. There's a kind of tragedy in this wrath. But nevertheless, that sort of directedness and will begins to emerge. So we have the Bhagavad Gita is also this kind of go forth, right? And the Iliad, of course, sing goddess the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles. So there's this directedness, there is this headedness, there's this will. And a perfect myth for this is the birth of Athena, of course, from the head of Zeus, splitting open through the head. And again, it's just sort of like moving away from these natural things and into the kind of the mind and the mental, as we're kind of nearing the mentat, the mental structure of consciousness beginning to assert itself. So, and I'm just mentioning here that those are good examples. The Zeus splitting the head, his head is splitting, and Athena being born. And Athena, of course, is owl-eyed. She can see. She has, again, it's the eyes that are important, the seeing that is important, the awakening and the capacity for seeing in darkness for Athena. And Athens, of course, becomes a very famous city, 5th or 6th century, the rise of the academy and philosophy and what we consider today very mental activities. By far not the only one. As I reiterate, there's many different examples, but this is just what Gebser is doing in EPO. Mental is from the word menin or menace, and the Iliad is the hero's journey, and of course, the ordered course of action by men. Greek menace meaning wrath, and the Latin word, which means intent, anger, thinking, thought, the furrowed brow, the man in contemplation, this kind of patriarchal, ego-oriented, mental-oriented consciousness kind of surging forth. The mental, though, is directed thought, and the triangle is the image of that direction, as we mentioned, is seeing perspectival space. So even this early on in ancient Greece, we can kind of see the rise of perspectivity just a little bit. And I just want to pause here, and this is just a triangle associating Christianity with the mental and the Trinity. Before we get into sort of the breakdown and the integral where we close today, does anybody have any questions? And again, there's the chat box right here. So if you have any questions, let me know. If you want me to just keep going, wrap it up, we get to Q&A, that's cool. But just let me know. Just send a message in the chat box or in the Q&A box. So yeah, so the mental rational is, this part is important to understand the structures, because the mental rational and any structure of any structures of consciousness, as we talk about them, they have an efficient phase and a deficient phase, meaning they have a period of creativity and vitality and usefulness and helpfulness and sort of like creating a new world and asserting a new reality. And then they have a kind of a period where they begin to not be as useful. They begin to be more rigid and ossify. They begin to no longer effectively translate the world and respond to the crisis that the structure brought forth. It can't solve its own problems. So for this mental rational, the ratio is a deficient phase of the mental. It's the excess of quantification, the excess of materialization, the ego hypertrophy that we've been talking about. So abstraction begins to transform itself into extreme form of manifestation, and as we mentioned, atomization, fragmentation, isolation, etc. Let me see here. I think we got a question in the Q&A. So PH is asking, does Gebser let's see, does Gebser conflate the origin with the archaic, a la Wilbur, and thus one's orientation to the structures pivots differently? I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, PH, but Gebser doesn't necessarily say that even though the archaic is origin, it's a kind of latent origin. It's a kind of all of the other structures haven't burst forth. It's like the seed pod. Everything is contained within it in potential, but not everything is expressed, concretized, realized. It's sort of like the seed and the flower. So everything's within it, but it just needs to spring forth. And Gebser, I think to kind of circle around what you're saying, he wasn't a romanticist, and I know Ken Wilber, who's another integral scholar, very different take on this whole structure of consciousness. Gebser saw the past as necessary and nonlinear, and the archaic is that the wholeness that we sort of intuitively emerged from, but the path between the archaic and the integral is a kind of dip into time, a kind of creative concretization of all of these different structures and realizing the whole. So there's no need to be romantic and go back and before the fall of Eden. I guess you could say in a mythological tale there was a fall, there was a unity consciousness, but in order to realize the dimensions of origin in time and through time is sort of the if we're going to say, because this is a very mental thing, the telos. Teilhard de Chardin uses this more, or Gebser doesn't use telos at all. But if there is a kind of realization or concretization taking place, it's to realize origin through time. So he sidesteps and avoids the problem of being a romantic or a progressive optimist by saying, the realization of the structures of consciousness are a messy, non-linear thing where you're going to need the magic and the mythic being on one hand, you're going to need the mental on the other to come together through the integral. They don't really, they may emerge through time in a linear way, but there really are like two sides of a whole, which is much, much more infinite, a sphere, as it were. I hope that answered your question a little bit. But yeah, please let me know in the chat or Q&A if you have any other questions. So here we go. Let me go move into the integral. So yeah, sorry, 1 second. Here we go. So yeah, he's talking about today, and we don't really need to go into this so much, but he's talking about the breakdown into parts and how the parts don't make a whole. When you add them all together, it's a fictitious whole, not an efficacious whole, and that's what this integrality is. And so here is where we get into the integral structure, and Gebser writes, only where the world is space-free and time-free, where wearing gains validity, where the world and we reserves, the whole become transparent. And where the diaphanous and what is rendered diaphanous become the volition of the world, does the world become concrete and integral. And I know it's a little like, okay, what's he really saying here? Space freedom, time freedom, and this is where we really get into what's going on today. And we're going to save most of this for the January class, but just to give you a primer on the integral. Gebser writes that the harbingers of tomorrow, the evidence of transformation, and other signs of the new and imminent cannot have gone entirely unnoticed. And really with the integral structure, as we've seen, sort of the mental, moving into the mental rational, becoming deficient, becoming stuck with quantification and ratio and spatialization of consciousness and reality. Spatialization of time, for instance, is sort of the adding up of time, not having enough time. Gebser writes that, to have no time, to be running out of time is to have no soul. So it's this idea that by measuring and quantifying ourselves to such an extent, we've sort of deflated the ability of the mental to grasp reality. And it really is the only way through is the leap into the integral, the leap to realize time. And time isn't linearity. Time is not rhythmicity. Time is not timelessness alone. Time is the origin. Time is the achronon. Time is this sort of multi-dimensional seeing through of all of the different forms of time and space and structures of consciousness. It's the whole. The integral and the archaic are origin. So Gebser is basically saying, in order to confront the problems of our world today and to really respond creatively, to have this sort of mutation in our own consciousness, we have to become aware. We must wear the whole. We must wear the integrum, as he says here. And that's only done through the concretion of time. And the concretion of time, you say, is a precondition. Yeah, he's talking about a fully completed wholeness, the bringing about of an integrum, the reestablishment of the inviolate and pristine state of origin by incorporating the wealth of all subsequent achievement. He's talking about everything that's been going on with the structures through history. This means that the various structures that constitute him must become transparent to him. And this is the kind of work that we can do as individuals in wrestling with coming to bring these older structures back online and not see them as older, but as things that constitute us, as dimensions of our own reality, of our own being. And the more that we do that, the more we are this integral being. And so the integral structure, let's just see what we can do here really quickly before everybody falls asleep or needs to go. We've been going for about 90 minutes, and probably will end up going a little bit longer. But again, please start sending in your questions. The important point here that we can kind of close at is that the mental was the rational wakefulness, and the integral is the irrational lucidity. It is diaphanous and present. And if the mental was that triangle of space and perspective, the integral is a transparent sphere. It's a seeing through the world, very similar to the kind of idea in the symbolic mythical consciousness of reading the text of nature, the living text of nature. But even more so than that, it's seeing through even the kind of mental. It's the dreaming consciousness and the waking consciousness through a more intensified mode of being that sees through both. And very mystical, and you might say kind of Buddhist in the way it's looking at these different states and seeing through these different states. And of course, it's about the concretation of time and the realization of time, not necessarily spatializing and graphing and mapping and quantifying. The integral is asking a lot more of us here, which I think is important to note. Now let's see some questions. Can you define some of these words? Wearing, virish, and diaphanous. Yeah, so wearing, this is, Gebser is not very, he's kind of abstruse with some of his language. Interestingly, he's very careful and very intuitive, but he's also, he brings a lot to the table as well to try to pick apart. So for me, and for what I understand Gebser saying about wearing, it's, instead of using the word seeing, there's an awareness through. There's a wearing, as in kind of a transparency, an apprehension of transparency of these different structures, which doesn't have anything exclusively to do with sight or hearing or your gut. There's this sort of higher dimension. I don't even want to use higher or lower. It's even kind of beyond the higher and the lower. A perception, the a perspectival. I'm giving you another term for that term. Virition is an interesting word that he uses to talk about moving away from philosophy and going into virition, which is it's a direct knowledge of truth, of spiritual truth. It's a kind of gnosis. It might be a word that you can very carefully relate to that. So we move from another word. Gosh, I'm dropping another one. Etiology is another word. Philosophy to etiology, which requires virition, which requires a direct encounter with truth. Sri Aurobindo has a more linear, at least painted in a very linear sense of higher and higher ascending stages of mind, and he describes this as moving from intellectual knowledge, human knowledge, into these kind of higher spiritual knowledge that isn't gathered together and pieced together and figured out, but known directly and totally with a whole. And I think that's sort of a good way to understand that. Diaphany is similar to wearing in that it's a seeing through, and that reality is diaphany. The structures of consciousness, time, and space are diaphanous, and there's a level of our being that's very direct and not abstract. In the same way that we've understood all these and lived through these structures, there is a structure of our being, a wholeness of our being that sees through the world, sees through the magic, mental, mythical, and archaic, and is whole. So seeing from a wearing through wholeness, through origin in ourselves, realized in ourselves. So I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but it's my attempt. And as you see in this quote here, what I have, and I want to read the whole thing, but he's listing all of these different types of time, like clock time, rhythm, meter, mutation, relativity, mental dividing, even ratio. All of these, he's saying everything, every type of time and experience of time and the structures is a perspectival. It is the integral. It's even motoricity. And interestingly, he talks the creative principle and power of the imagination. So he's saying that the whole is all of these things, and we need to see the whole, or aware the whole, or wear the whole through us. And it requires this kind of diaphanous movement where all of these things are perceived. So I hope that helped a little bit. I'm going to quickly summarize here. To end, he's talking about this is not freedom from previous time forms. They are co-constituents of each and every one of us. It is to begin with the freedom for all time forms. So if that would be the main difference between what we would say romantics who wish to kind of leave time and space and go into this sort of Gnostic ascent, transcendental ascent into higher realms or spiritual worlds or eternity or so on, the integral, very similar to what Sri Aurobindo and Terre de Chardin were saying, is this kind of bringing through into the world origin, or the spiritual, or the logos even. So it's not destroying the ego, but sort of allowing the ego to be and just making it transparent to its origins. It's not undoing creation, but seeing through creation and therefore participating with origin. Might be another way to put it. So it's not above previous time forms, et cetera, et cetera. Here is just a good image of, here we go, of everything so far. And you have the structures on the left, you have their dimensionality, you have then their qualities in terms of time, and then just another description of what they are in terms of more integral speak, as it were. And as you can see, like, as we mentioned, the archaic is synonymous with origin and integral. It's zero dimensionality. It's pre-space and pre-temporal. The magic is the point. It's spaceless is timeless. Unitary wovenness and fusion. The mythic is the circle. The polarity and dynamism of movement and rhythm. Spaceless is natural temporality. Circular and polar, complementary. The mental is the triangle, that directedness, the mens. Abstractly temporal, and it's directed / dual opposites. We didn't really get into that too much, but logic and sort of working with paradox and those kind of things becomes less of complementary opposites and more of tensions to be worked out through mental dialectics. And if you're not familiar with a dialectic, just Google that. Hegel and Marx and all those folks who talk about this sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and the sort of triangular movement of figuring out a problem and having a reaction to an action, and then a synthesis that brings them together and moves on. That's very mental. The integral is the sphere. It's space-free and it's time-free, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not in space or in time. There's a kind of freedom through things. Again, diaphanous and rendering whole. And let's see. That's it. I've got some. Here we go. Let me take some questions before I go on to the homework, which is completely optional, by the way, before the next class, when we go into contemporary manifestations of the integral consciousness, sort of looking at our current time and current forms of art in our time. Henry Bergson in Creative Evolution, Tommy says, uses duration that I feel gives one interesting viewpoint regarding the concept of time you have described. Yes, that's a very good point. And Bergson is a great example, as we kind of very briefly mentioned earlier, of a somebody who's looking at time. He's looking at memory. He's looking at the elan vital of nature, right? He's looking at what time actually means as a kind of qualitative thing, rather than necessarily a linear sequential thing. So I really recommend reading Creative Evolution if anybody has the time, or even if you don't have the time, to just come back to it again and again and try to really work with these kind of fundamentals. Because when you do, and when you read Ever Present Origin, when you read Henri Bergson and these kinds of writers like Sri Aurobindo is another, they have an effect on you in the reading of these things, and they can kind of work through you and work on you as you kind of open up to them. So it just takes a lot of time and patience, obviously, with this kind of scholarship, to kind of cram a book that could take a 7-week seminar into a 90-minute class. It's kind of difficult, as you can see, but hopefully I did a decent enough job for everybody to at least kind of get their toes wet and get kind of an experience of these things. So yeah, please, questions, comments, anything. Love to hear your feedback, everybody. And as well, my homework for tonight or this week, next 2 weeks, watch The Cave of Forgotten Dreams. It's on Netflix. It might be on YouTube, might be somewhere else. You could get the Blu-ray. Put on a pair of headphones, or if you don't have anything fancy, just watch it on your phone and with the lights out and earbuds in, and just kind of experience that movie. Really do. I've never had a movie have as much of an effect in sort of translating and communicating this sort of primordial, originary, magical, archaic consciousness than that. And just a lot to think about. It's very contemplative, and there's beautiful, as you heard, orchestration, and just a lot of contemplation. And a lot of the scientists, one of the scientists in the story has this kind of Petrarch moment in connecting with these structures, these older structures, because he's a scientist mapping out the caves with a computer. And he starts to have this dream of the lions coming to him in dreams as he's working with them, which is quite a profound encounter with a numinous being. Perhaps he was tapping into something ancestrally or primordially, the structures. So really kind of check that out. And in terms of what to do, in terms of exercises, this is a book. You sit and you read, and like I said, the book has an effect on you. It's the book that can kind of change your life. But it's not going to, you shouldn't do that alone. It's really asking you to do what Gebser was doing. Gebser is asking you to kind of experience the structures in yourself. So as an exercise, I'm suggesting spend time doing some contemplation and discerning the structures within yourself, your experience of time and space at different points of the day. Notice your sense of space and the passing of time while watching this documentary, for instance. Remember my question about, how did time pass for you in a movie theater? What was your sense of space like when you're in a movie theater or you're at home with all the lights out? What is that kind of symbolic, imagistic sense of space that the technology of cinema retrieves? Because it's certainly not perspectival. Spend time paying attention to sound and the inner images you associate with those sounds. Listen to music. Do the sounds have forms and shapes? What meaning do they communicate to you? Listen very carefully. If you remember your dreams, notice the sense of space and movement in your dream. Notice any symbolic profundity in your dreams as well, the sense of meanings at the beings and presences you encounter. And then, of course, explore your sense of will yourself in material space. And maybe drink a cup of coffee and go for a run. And that could be an altered state in itself as well. But contemplate and witness all of these states and who is watching them as you move through them. And if you want, write down these observations, share them with us next time. Send an email, put them in the what you call it? Yeah, send me an email or post them in the Facebook group. And before I close, let me take some more questions here. So yeah, John Davis says thank you. Yeah, of course, and I'm happy to share this. Again, I hope it was digestible. And if it wasn't digestible, take some time and just let yourself process all of it. You can revisit this. I'm going to send everyone a PDF slides. There's going to be a page with everything on it you can download. And that'll be in an email. And yeah, Karen says, it's true. I've been reading Origin for over 10 years. Or check out Herzog. Good. Patricia, do you plan on tying this to Ken Wilber's integral theory? I do want to bring some comparative work with integral theory, but really, I'm not alone in this. I really feel that Gebser has been so miniaturized within integral theory that he really, ever-present origin and this kind of approach to the structures of consciousness is a phenomenological approach, even just beyond Gebser, but a phenomenological approach to the evolution of consciousness is really so important that, there's plenty of work on Wilber and the developmental maps already. I have no problem mentioning and making some connections, but I personally have more critiques in how Wilber uses it. Certainly an important work himself with developing transpersonal psychology and popularizing Gebser. He's the only guy who talked about Gebser for the 80s, besides George Feuerstein and the academic work, of course, and the Gene Gebser Society. Of course, they did. But just in terms of sort of approaching popular consciousness culture with this. Thompson talks a little bit about it, a little grumpy in Coming Into Being, how, as mentioned right here, supplementary reading to help you through Gebser, that, he'll give you the real deal. But Wilber, the emphasis on the maps and the development, it's a little too abstract for me. I tend to gravitate toward the poets and the artists and the philosophers who are comfortable in that sort of messy phenomenological space. Feuerstein has a great book, Structures of Consciousness. It's hard to get, but I recommend it if you can get it, even from the library. Aaron Cheek has a good book. He's going to, though. He's the one translating Gebser's works. He's beginning a long project of translating many of his works to English, so we may begin to see more Gebserian scholars in the English-speaking world. But this is a great essay. I will link to it. It's a very long essay, so it's practically a short book. Highly recommended, very in-depth, and very insightful in sort of understanding what Gebser's talking about with diaphony especially. And Gebser Society, of course. The Gebser Society, we meet every single year, and Heather Fester is actually one of the folks who are heading it up this year. And she's putting it together at Naropa University in the fall, in October. So you're more than welcome to join us at Naropa for, I'm not sure what the topic's going to be. We're working on it right now. But every year, if you like this is what the Gebser conference is every year. Everybody bringing some aspect, wrestling with something. It's an intensive, it could be transformative, and I love it. So I think that's everything. Yep, because next time we're doing this part where we go to the contemporary days. Let's see, look forward to the next one. Great, thank you. And yeah, thanks everybody. If you have any questions, you can email me. And if you want to, well, let me just post this in the chat box really quick. We meet January 4th next. And if you'd like to donate and support NeuroLearning, that's the little consciousness study school that I've helped to put together. You can do that there at support. You can support me individually on Patreon. That's my Patreon link right there. And you can learn more about the Gen Gebser Society at gebser.org. And there's the link there to phenomenology if you're interested in the Stanford Encyclopedia to kind of explore this a little bit more and do a little bit more deep diving if you dare. So yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we will see each other next round. And if you have any questions, let me know, and I'd be happy to email you back. I'm going to type my email here, jeremy@neurolearning.com. All right, everyone, take care, have a good day, and we'll see you in the other end, the other side of the year, other side of the temporal divide. Take care, everybody.